The Green Valley Environmental Coalition disappeared on the evening of October 15, 2007, just hours after delivering what would become their final presentation at the Riverside Community Center, where they had spent 3 intense hours detailing environmental violations and financial irregularities they had discovered within the city administration and local industries. The group of 5 dedicated environmental activists had spent the last 2 years investigating what initially appeared to be routine permit violations, but had evolved into something far more complex and troubling than anyone in the small city of Millbrook could have imagined. Maya Thompson, the 29-year-old environmental lawyer who served as the coalition's coordinator, lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on Elm Street that had become the unofficial headquarters for their research activities. Her morning routine during those final weeks always began with reviewing the extensive documentation they had compiled, followed by coordinating with her 4 colleagues who had become like family in their shared pursuit of environmental justice. The coalition had formed organically 18 months earlier, brought together by shared concerns about increasing industrial development that seemed to prioritize profit over environmental protection and community health. David Chen, a 32-year-old freelance journalist specializing in environmental reporting, had moved to Millbrook after working for several metropolitan newspapers covering industrial pollution cases. His investigative skills proved invaluable in tracking permit applications, environmental impact assessments, and the complex paper trails that connected various industrial projects throughout the region. David's background in environmental journalism helped the group understand how regulatory systems were supposed to function and identify where those systems were failing or being deliberately circumvented. Rebecca Washington, a 26-year-old recent graduate with degrees in environmental science and public policy, had initially volunteered to monitor city council meetings as part of a graduate research project. However, she remained involved when she began noticing patterns in permit approvals and environmental assessments that seemed to favor industrial interests over community concerns and ecological protection. Her academic training provided the scientific foundation necessary to understand complex environmental data and identify discrepancies in official reports. Marcus Rodriguez worked as a construction supervisor specializing in environmental remediation projects and had become increasingly concerned about industrial sites he was contracted to assess throughout the region. The 34-year-old had 15 years of experience in environmental construction and had never encountered the level of regulatory shortcuts, inadequate cleanup standards, and documentation irregularities he was witnessing in Millbrook and surrounding areas. His technical expertise in soil contamination, water quality, and hazardous material handling provided crucial insights into how environmental regulations were being violated. Jennifer Thompson, a 28-year-old public health researcher, had joined the coalition after noticing concerning patterns in community health data that seemed to correlate with industrial activities in specific neighborhoods. Her background in epidemiology and community health assessment helped the group understand the human impact of environmental violations and provided scientific credibility to their advocacy efforts. Jennifer's research revealed connections between industrial emissions and increased rates of respiratory conditions, particularly among children and elderly residents in areas near major industrial facilities. Their investigation had begun when Maya noticed irregularities in environmental impact statements for a proposed chemical processing facility. The documentation seemed to underestimate potential environmental impacts while overestimating the economic benefits to the community. What started as concern about one questionable project gradually revealed a systematic pattern of environmental corners being cut, regulatory oversight being minimized, and community input being dismissed or ignored entirely. The breakthrough came when Marcus provided internal assessment reports that showed significant discrepancies between official environmental compliance documentation and actual site conditions at multiple industrial locations. Cross-referencing this information with David's research into permit approval processes revealed a disturbing pattern of applications being fast-tracked through regulatory review with minimal public notice or environmental scrutiny. Rebecca's analysis of environmental impact assessments showed that negative findings were consistently minimized or omitted from final reports presented to approval committees. As their investigation expanded throughout the summer of 2007, The coalition began to understand that they had uncovered a comprehensive system designed to prioritize industrial development over environmental protection. Their documentation revealed coordination between city officials, state regulatory agencies, and industrial representatives that resulted in systematic violations of environmental protection standards. Jennifer's health research provided compelling evidence that these regulatory failures were having measurable impacts on community health, particularly in neighborhoods with predominantly low-income and minority populations. Their weekly coordination meetings at Maya's apartment became increasingly intense as evidence accumulated. Each member brought specialized expertise that contributed to a comprehensive understanding of how environmental protection systems were being compromised. David's journalistic investigations revealed financial relationships between regulatory officials and industrial interests, while Marcus provided technical documentation showing how environmental standards were being violated at operational sites throughout the region. The atmosphere in Millbrook began to shift as word of their investigation spread through environmental networks and community organizations. Maya noticed that her requests for public records were being delayed or returned with crucial information redacted, while city officials who had previously been accessible became unresponsive to inquiries. David found that sources within regulatory agencies became reluctant to provide information, and several individuals who had initially been willing to discuss environmental concerns stopped returning calls entirely. By September 2007, the Green Valley Environmental Coalition had compiled extensive documentation that revealed systematic environmental violations involving multiple industrial facilities, regulatory agencies, and municipal departments. Their evidence suggested that over several years, environmental protection standards had been systematically undermined through inadequate oversight, falsified compliance reports, and deliberate suppression of negative environmental data. The scope of the violations indicated coordination among industrial operators, regulatory officials, and local political figures who benefited financially from reduced environmental oversight. The decision to present their findings publicly was reached after extensive discussion about the potential consequences of challenging established industrial and political interests. The coalition understood that their evidence threatened profitable relationships and could result in significant legal and financial consequences for multiple parties. Maya advocated for complete transparency, arguing that the environmental and health impacts they had documented posed immediate risks to community welfare that outweighed concerns about political or economic disruption. They scheduled their presentation for October 15th at the Riverside Community Center, selecting the venue because it was public property and could accommodate the large attendance they anticipated. In the weeks leading up to the presentation, they distributed information throughout the community and contacted regional environmental organizations, hoping to build support for the regulatory reforms they believed were necessary. The response revealed deep divisions within the community, with some residents expressing strong support for environmental protection, while others worried about economic impacts of increased regulatory oversight. Maya coordinated the final preparation efforts, working with each coalition member to organize their extensive documentation into a comprehensive presentation that would be accessible to community members without technical backgrounds. The group spent countless hours during the final week reviewing their evidence, preparing visual materials, and anticipating questions or challenges they might face from audience members or officials who might attend the presentation. The weekend before the presentation, all 5 coalition members gathered at Maya's apartment for their final preparation session. They distributed presentation responsibilities, reviewed their supporting documentation one more time, and discussed strategies for handling potentially hostile questions or attempts to discredit their findings. The atmosphere was tense but determined, with each member understanding that they were about to challenge powerful interests that had significant resources to defend themselves. On the morning of October 15th, the coalition members met at Murphy's Diner for what would be their final breakfast together, though none of them knew it at the time. The conversation focused on final logistics, technical details of their presentation, and contingency plans if the meeting became confrontational. David had arranged for comprehensive recording of the presentation, while Jennifer prepared summary materials that highlighted the health impacts of the environmental violations they had documented. The evening presentation exceeded all expectations in terms of community engagement, with the community center filled to capacity and additional attendees gathering outside. Maya provided opening remarks that contextualized their investigation within broader environmental justice concerns, while each coalition member presented their specific area of expertise. Marcus detailed technical violations at industrial sites. David explained the regulatory failures that enabled continued violations. Rebecca presented scientific analysis of environmental impacts, and Jennifer documented the health consequences for community members. The audience response was passionate and diverse, with many community members expressing outrage at the environmental risks they had been unknowingly exposed to, while others questioned the economic implications of stricter environmental enforcement. Several attendees provided additional information about environmental concerns they had observed, while others demanded immediate action from regulatory agencies and elected officials. The presentation lasted nearly 3 hours, with the coalition providing detailed responses to technical questions and offering copies of their supporting documentation to interested community members. Following the formal presentation, the 5 coalition members spent additional time speaking individually with community members who wanted more specific information about environmental conditions in their neighborhoods. Several people expressed interest in joining ongoing advocacy efforts, while others offered to provide additional documentation or testimony that might strengthen future regulatory complaints. The coalition agreed to meet the following morning to plan their next steps, including formal complaints to state and federal environmental agencies. The 5 members of the Green Valley Environmental Coalition left the community center that evening, feeling exhausted, but optimistic about the community response and the potential for meaningful environmental reform. They had planned to spend the following days organizing follow-up activities and engaging with media outlets interested in covering their findings. However, none of them made it home that night. Their vehicles were found the next morning in various locations around Millbrook, but Maya Thompson, David Chen, Rebecca Washington, Marcus Rodriguez, and Jennifer Thompson had vanished without a trace. The morning of October 16, 2007, began with an eerie quiet that would forever mark the beginning of Millbrook's most haunting mystery. At precisely 9 o'clock, the Riverside Community Center remained locked, its parking lot empty except for the maintenance supervisor's truck and 5 abandoned vehicles that would soon become central evidence in a case that would perplex investigators for years to come. The Green Valley Environmental Coalition had scheduled a follow-up press conference to address media questions about their previous evening's presentation, but as the minutes ticked by, it became increasingly clear that something was terribly wrong. Patricia Chen, David's wife of 4 years, was the first to raise an alarm. She had expected her husband to return home by midnight after the presentation, knowing his habit of staying late to network with potential sources and gather additional information. When she woke at 6:30 to find his side of the bed untouched and no messages on their home answering machine, concern began to gnaw at her consciousness. David was methodical about communication, always calling if his plans changed or if he would be staying out later than expected. By 8 o'clock, Patricia had called his cell phone 6 times, each call going directly to voicemail. Meanwhile, across town, Jennifer Thompson's elderly mother, Eleanor, was experiencing similar anxiety. Jennifer lived with her mother to help with daily care needs, and her absence was immediately noticeable when Eleanor woke to find the house silent and Jennifer's bed unslept in. Eleanor called Jennifer's cell phone repeatedly throughout the early morning hours, growing increasingly worried as each call remained unanswered. By 7:30, she had contacted her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, asking if she had seen Jennifer return home the previous evening. Maya Thompson's absence was discovered when her law office colleague, attorney Michael Harrison, arrived at their shared practice to find Maya's morning appointments unattended and her office exactly as she had left it the previous afternoon. Maya was known for her punctuality and professional reliability, making her unexplained absence particularly alarming. Michael immediately called Maya's apartment, receiving no answer, then contacted the courthouse where Maya had planned to file several documents that morning. When courthouse staff confirmed that Maya had not appeared for her scheduled appointments, Michael's concern escalated to genuine fear. Rebecca Washington's graduate advisor, Professor Linda Matthews, became worried when Rebecca failed to attend their scheduled research meeting at the university. Rebecca had been excited about presenting her environmental policy findings and had specifically requested the early morning meeting to discuss incorporating her coalition work into her thesis research. When Rebecca failed to appear and didn't respond to phone calls, Professor Matthews contacted the university security office and requested a welfare check at Rebecca's off-campus apartment. Marcus Rodriguez's construction crew supervisor, Tony Hernandez, discovered Marcus's absence when the work crew assembled at their usual meeting point for the day's assignments. Marcus served as lead supervisor for several ongoing projects and had never missed a scheduled workday without advance notice. His absence was particularly concerning because he carried the only set of keys to several equipment storage containers, preventing the crew from accessing necessary tools and materials. Tony immediately contacted Marcus's emergency contact number, reaching his sister Maria, who confirmed that Marcus had not returned home the previous evening. The 5 abandoned vehicles were discovered simultaneously by different individuals throughout the morning hours. Maya's silver Honda Accord was found in the Riverside Community Center parking lot by maintenance supervisor Carl Williams, who arrived at 7 o'clock to unlock the building for scheduled morning activities. The car was properly parked, locked, with Maya's presentation materials still visible on the back seat, along with her leather briefcase and a thermos of coffee that appeared to have been recently purchased. David's blue Toyota Camry was located 3 blocks away in the municipal library parking lot by librarian Susan Foster, who noticed the vehicle because it was parked in a handicapped space without proper permits. When Susan approached to leave a warning notice, she recognized the vehicle from previous occasions when David had researched municipal records at the library. The car was locked, with David's laptop bag visible in the passenger seat, along with several notebooks and recording equipment he had used during the previous evening's presentation. Rebecca's red Volkswagen Beetle was discovered in the parking lot behind Murphy's Diner by restaurant owner Frank Murphy, who arrived early to begin breakfast preparations. The vehicle was parked in an area typically reserved for employee parking, though Rebecca had never worked at the diner. Frank found the car unlocked, with Rebecca's purse sitting on the passenger seat containing her identification, credit cards, and over $200 in cash, suggesting that robbery was not a motive for her disappearance. Jennifer's green Ford Focus was found in the community park, adjacent to the Riverside Community Center, by jogger Amanda Collins, who noticed the vehicle because it was parked in a no-parking zone near the playground equipment. The car contained Jennifer's public health research materials, including survey data and interview transcripts related to her environmental health investigation. Her cell phone was found on the dashboard, apparently turned off or with a depleted battery. Marcus's black Chevrolet pickup truck was discovered in the parking lot of a 24-hour convenience store, approximately 1 mile from the community center by store clerk Kevin Walsh during his morning shift change. The vehicle was properly parked and locked, containing Marcus's construction tools, safety equipment, and environmental assessment instruments he had used to document violation conditions at various industrial sites. A half-consumed coffee cup in the truck's cup holder suggested that Marcus had made a recent purchase, though store security footage from the previous evening showed no record of his visit. The discovery of all 5 vehicles within a relatively small geographic area, combined with the coalition members' failure to appear for scheduled appointments and activities, prompted family members to contact the Millbrook Police Department. However, the initial police response was disappointingly inadequate, reflecting a common institutional reluctance to treat missing adult cases with appropriate urgency, particularly when the missing individuals were known to be involved in controversial political activities. Detective Robert Sullivan, assigned to coordinate the initial investigation, approached the case with skepticism that would later prove both misguided and professionally damaging. Sullivan's preliminary assessment focused on the possibility that the coalition members had voluntarily departed the area to avoid potential legal or political consequences of their environmental accusations. His report noted that the missing individuals were environmental activists involved in making serious accusations against local officials and business interests, and suggested that their disappearance might represent a strategic withdrawal to avoid potential defamation lawsuits or other legal challenges. This interpretation was reinforced by Police Chief William Morrison, who had been present at the previous evening's presentation and felt personally attacked by some of the coalition's accusations regarding inadequate law enforcement response to environmental violations. Chief Morrison's public statement suggested that the missing activists were likely hiding out until the controversy dies down, and indicated that the police department would treat the case as a low priority unless evidence of foul play emerged. The families of the missing coalition members found the police response frustrating and inadequate, particularly given the obvious signs that their loved ones had not planned or prepared for extended absence. Patricia Chen organized the first family meeting 3 days after the disappearance, bringing together relatives and close friends to coordinate independent search efforts and share information that might be relevant to understanding what had happened. During this initial family gathering, several disturbing patterns emerged that had not been apparent to individual family members. Eleanor Thompson revealed that Jennifer had received several anonymous phone calls during the weeks leading up to the presentation, with callers hanging up when Jennifer answered or making vague comments about minding her own business. Patricia Chen disclosed that David had become increasingly paranoid about being followed, mentioning on several occasions that he noticed the same vehicles in different locations during his daily activities. Maya's law partner, Michael Harrison, attended the family meeting to share information about unusual incidents at their law office during the final weeks before the disappearance. He reported that their office had been broken into twice, though nothing appeared to have been stolen. However, both incidents involved files being disturbed, particularly those related to Maya's environmental research and public records requests. The break-ins had been reported to police, but no investigation was conducted beyond taking basic incident reports. Rebecca's graduate advisor, Professor Matthews, provided additional context about pressure Rebecca had been experiencing from university administrators regarding her environmental research. According to Professor Matthews, Rebecca had been advised by department officials to focus on less controversial topics for her thesis research and had been discouraged from incorporating her coalition activism into her academic work. The professor expressed concern that Rebecca's environmental advocacy might have academic consequences that the young graduate student had not fully anticipated. Marcus's construction crew colleagues, organized by Supervisor Tony Hernandez, contributed information about incidents at work sites that had made Marcus increasingly uncomfortable during the months leading up to his disappearance. Several crew members reported that Marcus had been pressured by project managers to ignore environmental violations he had documented, with implications that his continued employment depended on his discretion regarding regulatory shortcuts he had observed. The family group decided to hire private investigator Amanda Foster, a former state police detective who specialized in missing person cases and had experience with politically sensitive investigations. Foster's initial assessment confirmed that the police department's approach was inadequate and potentially compromised by conflicts of interest, given that several officials who might be implicated in the coalition's environmental accusations were involved in the official investigation. Private investigator Foster's preliminary findings revealed several troubling aspects of the disappearance that had been overlooked or dismissed by official investigators. Her analysis of the abandoned vehicles suggested that the coalition members had left the community center together, possibly in a sixth vehicle that had not been identified. The positioning of the abandoned cars in different locations throughout Millbrook indicated a deliberate effort to create confusion about the circumstances of the disappearance. Foster's interviews with community center staff and attendees from the October 15th presentation revealed that several individuals had observed the coalition members speaking with unidentified persons in the parking lot after the formal presentation concluded. These witnesses described seeing Maya, David, Rebecca, Jennifer, and Marcus in conversation with 2 or 3 individuals who did not appear to be local residents and had not attended the presentation. However, these witnesses had not been interviewed by official investigators, despite their potential importance to understanding the coalition's final movements. The media response to the disappearance was limited and largely unsympathetic, reflecting the controversial nature of the coalition's environmental accusations and the influence of local business interests on regional news coverage. The Millbrook Daily Herald published only brief notices about the missing activists, focusing more on the disruption caused by their absence than on the potential implications of their disappearance. Regional television stations provided minimal coverage, treating the story as a minor local incident rather than a significant development with potential environmental and political ramifications. As the first week passed without any sign of the missing coalition members, the case began to attract attention from environmental organizations and civil rights groups throughout the region. The Sierra Club and several other environmental advocacy organizations issued statements expressing concern about the disappearance and calling for comprehensive investigation of potential connections to the coalition's environmental research. These organizations pointed out that environmental activists had faced intimidation and threats in other communities and suggested that the Millbrook case might represent a more serious pattern of suppression of environmental advocacy. Family members attempted to maintain public attention on the case by organizing search efforts and vigils, but their activities received limited community support. Many Millbrook residents seemed reluctant to become involved in a situation that had clear political implications and potential consequences for local economic interests. The community's response reflected deep divisions about environmental regulation and the appropriate balance between economic development and environmental protection. By the end of October 2007, the official investigation had made no meaningful progress, and family members began to suspect that the police department was actively avoiding aggressive investigation of the case. Detective Sullivan's reports continued to emphasize the theory that the coalition members had voluntarily disappeared, despite growing evidence that their absence was not planned or voluntary. The detectives' reluctance to pursue leads suggested by private investigator Foster created additional frustration for families who were desperate for answers about their loved one's fate. The case entered a prolonged period of official inactivity during the final months of 2007, with police resources being redirected to other investigations and family members left to pursue independent search efforts with limited resources and diminishing hope. The Green Valley Environmental Coalition had vanished as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only their abandoned vehicles, their environmental research, and the haunting questions about what had happened during those final hours after their presentation at the Riverside Community Center. The year 2017 began like any other for the construction crew working on the new Interstate 94 expansion project. But March 15th would forever change the trajectory of one of America's most perplexing missing persons cases. Heavy equipment operator Jake Morrison was clearing debris from a remote section of undeveloped land, approximately 12 miles northeast of Millbrook, when his excavator struck something that clearly didn't belong in the natural landscape. What initially appeared to be discarded construction materials quickly revealed itself to be something far more significant when Morrison noticed fabric and what appeared to be personal belongings scattered among the disturbed earth. Morrison immediately contacted his supervisor, who in turn notified the county sheriff's department and the state police. Within hours, the construction site had been transformed into a crime scene, with forensic specialists carefully excavating an area that would yield the first concrete evidence related to the Green Valley Environmental Coalition's disappearance 10 years earlier. The discovery sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies that had long since relegated the case to inactive status and reopened wounds for family members who had never stopped hoping for answers about their loved one's fate. State Police Detective Captain Lisa Rodriguez, who had recently transferred to the regional office from the metropolitan area, took personal charge of the investigation from the moment the first evidence was confirmed. Rodriguez brought a fresh perspective to the case, having no prior involvement with the original investigation and no connections to local political or business interests that might compromise her objectivity. Her background in complex criminal investigations and her reputation for thoroughness made her the ideal candidate to lead what everyone understood would be a sensitive and high-profile reopening of a decade-old mystery. The forensic examination of the discovery site required 3 weeks of careful excavation and documentation, revealing a complex scene that suggested the location had been used for multiple purposes over an extended period. Along with human remains that would later be confirmed through dental records to belong to coalition members David Chen and Marcus Rodriguez, investigators found personal belongings, research materials, and electronic devices that had been buried in different areas of the site, suggesting that the location had been used as both a disposal site and a storage area for evidence. Among the most significant discoveries were waterproof containers holding extensive documentation that had been preserved despite years of burial. These materials included coalition research files, personal correspondence, and most importantly, digital storage devices containing information that had not been included in the coalition's public presentation. The recovered data revealed that the coalition's investigation had uncovered far more extensive environmental violations than they had disclosed, including evidence of federal regulatory violations and connections to state-level political figures who had influence over environmental policy decisions. Detective Rodriguez's analysis of the recovered materials revealed that the coalition had been in contact with federal environmental enforcement agencies during the weeks leading up to their disappearance, providing preliminary information about their findings and requesting guidance about proper channels for reporting their evidence. These communications, recovered from encrypted files on David Chen's laptop, indicated that the coalition had been preparing to file formal complaints with both the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Justice regarding the systematic environmental violations they had documented. The revelation that federal agencies had been aware of the coalition's investigation added new complexity to the case and raised disturbing questions about whether the activists' disappearance had been motivated by efforts to prevent federal intervention in local environmental enforcement. Detective Rodriguez immediately contacted the FBI to request information about any records related to the coalition's communications with federal agencies, initiating a parallel federal investigation that would significantly expand the scope of the case. Private investigator Amanda Foster, who had continued working on behalf of the families throughout the 10 years since the disappearance, welcomed the reopening of the official investigation while expressing frustration about the decade of inactivity that had allowed crucial evidence to deteriorate and witnesses to relocate or pass away. Foster had maintained detailed files throughout the intervening years, documenting patterns of environmental violations that had continued in Millbrook and surrounding areas, providing additional context for understanding the significance of the coalition's original research. Foster's decade of independent investigation had revealed that several individuals who had been present at the October 15, 2007 presentation had subsequently left Millbrook under circumstances that suggested they might have possessed information relevant to understanding the coalition's disappearance. She had attempted to maintain contact with these individuals, but had been unsuccessful in convincing them to provide detailed statements about their observations from that evening, reflecting the climate of fear and intimidation that had persisted in the community long after the activists vanished. The families of the missing coalition members experienced a complex mixture of relief and renewed anguish as the official investigation resumed. Patricia Chen, who had remarried and relocated to another state, returned to Millbrook to participate in the investigation and provide additional information about her late husband's activities during the final weeks before his disappearance. Her presence at the crime scene identification process was emotionally devastating, but also provided closure that had been absent for 10 years of uncertainty about David's fate. Eleanor Thompson, Jennifer's elderly mother, had passed away in 2014 without ever learning what had happened to her daughter, but Jennifer's sister Carol had maintained close contact with the other families and continued advocating for renewed investigation of the case. Carol's review of her sister's personal belongings, which had been preserved exactly as Jennifer had left them, revealed additional documentation that hadn't been available to earlier investigators, including correspondence with environmental health experts at major universities who had been providing technical assistance to the coalition's research. Maya Thompson's law partner, Michael Harrison, had maintained detailed records of the law office break-ins and other suspicious incidents that had occurred before Maya's disappearance, providing Detective Rodriguez with documentation that had been dismissed by the original investigators. Harrison's files revealed a pattern of surveillance and intimidation that extended beyond the coalition members themselves to include individuals and organizations that had supported their environmental advocacy efforts. The recovery of human remains from only 2 of the 5 missing coalition members raised troubling questions about the fate of Maya Thompson, Rebecca Washington, and Jennifer Thompson. Detective Rodriguez coordinated extensive additional excavation of the discovery site and surrounding areas, utilizing ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs to search for additional burial locations. While this expanded search revealed evidence of other disturbed areas, no additional human remains were recovered, suggesting that the other 3 coalition members might have been disposed of at different locations or under different circumstances. Forensic analysis of the recovered remains provided limited information about the circumstances of David Chen and Marcus Rodriguez's deaths, due to the extensive decomposition that had occurred over 10 years of burial. However, the positioning of the remains and associated evidence suggested that both individuals had been deceased for an extended period before burial, and that their bodies had been transported to the burial site rather than being killed at that location. This finding indicated a level of planning and organization that suggested the involvement of multiple individuals in the activists' disappearance. The discovery also included personal belongings that provided insight into the coalition members' final activities and state of mind during their last known hours. Rebecca Washington's field notebook contained detailed observations about environmental violations she had documented during the weeks leading up to the presentation, including photographs and soil samples that corroborated her scientific findings. Jennifer Thompson's public health research materials included interview transcripts with community members who had reported health problems they believed were related to industrial pollution, providing additional evidence of the real-world impact of the environmental violations the coalition had been investigating. Detective Rodriguez's investigation revealed that several key figures from the original case had died or relocated during the intervening decade, limiting the potential for witness interviews and creating challenges for understanding the full scope of what had happened in 2007. However, she was able to locate and interview several individuals who had been reluctant to speak with investigators at the time of the original disappearance, but were now willing to provide information, motivated by the passage of time and the discovery of concrete evidence that validated the seriousness of the case. Among the most significant new witnesses was former city employee Robert Martinez, who had left Millbrook shortly after the coalition's disappearance and had spent the subsequent decade working in environmental consulting in another state. Martinez revealed that he had been present during City Hall meetings, where officials discussed strategies for responding to the coalition's environmental accusations, including conversations about potential legal action against the activists, and discussions about their personal and professional vulnerabilities that could be exploited to discredit their research. Martinez's testimony provided the first direct evidence that city officials had viewed the coalition as a serious threat that required active response rather than simply ignoring their accusations or addressing them through normal regulatory channels. His recollections of specific conversations, corroborated by calendar records and meeting minutes that had been preserved in city archives, painted a disturbing picture of official coordination aimed at suppressing environmental advocacy rather than addressing the underlying violations that had been documented. Another crucial witness who emerged during the reopened investigation was former police dispatcher Nancy Williams, who had retired from the Millbrook Police Department in 2012, but had maintained detailed personal records of communications and incidents that had occurred during her tenure. Williams revealed that she had received several unusual radio communications during the early morning hours of October 16, 2007, including requests for police units to respond to locations that were not clearly identified, and communications that seemed to involve coordination with individuals who were not regular law enforcement personnel. Williams had been troubled by these irregular communications at the time, but had been discouraged from documenting them in official records by supervisory personnel, who indicated that the communications were related to ongoing sensitive operations that required confidentiality. Her decision to maintain personal records of these incidents, motivated by concerns about departmental integrity, provided Detective Rodriguez with timeline information that had been completely absent from the original investigation files. The accumulation of new evidence and witness testimony began to reveal the outline of a coordinated effort to silence the Green Valley Environmental Coalition that involved multiple agencies and individuals with varying levels of knowledge about the ultimate plan. Detective Rodriguez's analysis suggested that while some participants might have believed they were involved in legitimate law enforcement or regulatory activities, others had clearly understood that the coalition members were being targeted for elimination, rather than simply intimidation or legal action. As the investigation progressed throughout the spring and summer of 2017, Detective Rodriguez found herself facing many of the same obstacles that had hindered the original investigation, including reluctant witnesses, missing documentation, and institutional resistance to aggressive pursuit of leads that implicated local officials and business interests. However, the passage of time had also created new opportunities, as some individuals who had been involved in the original cover-up had died or lost their positions of influence, reducing their ability to obstruct the investigation. The reopened case attracted significant media attention, both locally and nationally, as environmental organizations and civil rights groups recognized the potential implications for understanding the risks faced by environmental advocates throughout the country. The case became a focal point for discussions about the protection of environmental activists and the need for independent oversight of local environmental enforcement, generating political pressure for thorough investigation and prosecution of those responsible for the coalition's disappearance. By the end of 2017, Detective Rodriguez had assembled a comprehensive picture of the events leading up to the coalition's disappearance, though significant gaps remained in understanding the specific details of how the plan had been executed and what had happened to the 3 coalition members whose remains had not been recovered. The investigation had evolved from a missing persons case into a complex criminal conspiracy involving environmental crimes, official corruption, and multiple counts of what appeared to be premeditated elimination of witnesses to serious regulatory violations. The breakthrough in the Green Valley Environmental Coalition case came on February 8, 2018, when former Millbrook City Councilman Thomas Bradley walked into Detective Rodriguez's office carrying a briefcase that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the investigation. Bradley, who had served on the city council from 2005 to 2009 before relocating to Florida, had returned to testify before a federal grand jury that had been convened to investigate the broader pattern of environmental and corruption violations that had emerged from the coalition case. His decision to cooperate with investigators stemmed from a terminal diagnosis that had prompted him to seek resolution for ethical compromises that had haunted him for over a decade. Bradley's briefcase contained copies of internal city communications, meeting recordings, and financial documents that he had secretly preserved as what he called insurance against potential future prosecution. These materials provided the first comprehensive documentation of the deliberate strategy that had been developed to neutralize the coalition's environmental advocacy efforts, revealing a level of coordination and premeditation that exceeded what investigators had previously suspected. The documents showed that city officials had been aware of the coalition's investigation for months before the public presentation and had been actively developing countermeasures designed to discredit their findings and eliminate their ability to pursue federal intervention. Among the most damaging documents were transcripts of recorded conversations between city officials, local business leaders, and individuals identified only by code names who appeared to have been brought in specifically to address the coalition situation. These conversations revealed that multiple options had been discussed for dealing with the environmental activists, ranging from legal challenges and character assassination to what was euphemistically referred to as permanent solutions for individuals who posed ongoing threats to established business relationships. Detective Rodriguez's analysis of Bradley's documentation revealed that the decision to eliminate the coalition members had not been made impulsively on the evening of October 15, 2007, but had been planned for several weeks as a contingency option if the activists could not be deterred through other means. The materials showed that surveillance of coalition members had been ongoing for months, with detailed records of their daily routines, personal relationships, and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited to either compromise their credibility or facilitate their disappearance. The investigation took a dramatic turn when federal prosecutors, working in coordination with Detective Rodriguez, announced the unsealing of indictments against 12 individuals connected to the conspiracy that had resulted in the coalition's disappearance. The charges ranged from conspiracy to commit federal environmental crimes to racketeering violations under the Organized Crime Control Act, reflecting the comprehensive nature of the criminal enterprise that had been operating in Millbrook and surrounding areas for several years. Among those indicted were former Police Chief William Morrison, who had deliberately obstructed the original investigation, former Mayor Robert Stevenson, who had coordinated the city's response to the coalition's environmental accusations, and several local business leaders who had benefited financially from the systematic environmental violations that the coalition had been investigating. However, the most significant arrests involved individuals who had not been publicly connected to the case, including 2 men identified as professional criminal operatives who had been contracted to carry out the actual elimination of the coalition members. The arrest of Vincent "Vinnie" Carlisle and Robert "Bobby" Torino, both with extensive criminal histories involving intimidation and violence in other states, provided investigators with the first opportunity to understand the specific details of how the coalition members had been eliminated. Under pressure from federal prosecutors and facing potential death penalty charges, Carlisle agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a life sentence without possibility of parole, providing detailed testimony about the events of October 15 and 16, 2007. According to Carlisle's testimony, the coalition members had been approached in the Riverside Community Center parking lot by individuals posing as federal environmental investigators who claimed to need immediate access to additional documentation that the activists had not included in their public presentation. The coalition members, believing they were finally receiving the federal attention they had been seeking, had willingly accompanied these individuals to what they believed would be a secure location for providing comprehensive briefings about their environmental findings. Instead, the 5 activists had been transported to an abandoned industrial facility approximately 20 miles from Millbrook, where they had been held for several days, while their captors attempted to determine the full extent of their investigation and identify any additional individuals who might have access to their research materials. During this period, the coalition members had been subjected to extensive questioning about their sources, their methods, and their plans for future advocacy activities, as their captors sought to understand whether eliminating the 5 activists would be sufficient to end the threat to established business interests. Carlisle's testimony revealed that David Chen and Marcus Rodriguez had been selected for elimination first because their professional backgrounds and investigative skills made them the greatest ongoing threat, even if they were relocated or intimidated into silence. The other 3 coalition members had initially been kept alive, while their captors determined whether they possessed specialized knowledge or documentation that might resurface elsewhere if not properly controlled. However, the decision had ultimately been made to eliminate all 5 activists to prevent any possibility of future prosecution or federal investigation. The revelation of what had happened to Maya Thompson, Rebecca Washington, and Jennifer Thompson during their final days provided closure for their families, while simultaneously creating new anguish about the suffering their loved ones had endured. According to Carlisle's account, all 3 women had maintained their commitment to environmental advocacy, even under extreme duress, refusing to provide information that might compromise other environmental advocates or community members who had supported their research efforts. Detective Rodriguez's investigation revealed that the bodies of the 3 missing coalition members had been disposed of through different methods and at different locations, making their recovery significantly more challenging than the burial site where David Chen and Marcus Rodriguez had been found. Maya Thompson's remains were ultimately located in a remote section of state forest land, approximately 40 miles from Millbrook, where they had been concealed in a manner designed to prevent discovery, even by extensive search efforts. Rebecca Washington and Jennifer Thompson had been disposed of at separate locations that reflected their captors' increasing paranoia about potential discovery as the investigation into their disappearance intensified during late 2007. Rebecca's remains were found in an abandoned mine shaft in a neighboring county, while Jennifer's body was recovered from a construction site that had been paved over shortly after her disposal, requiring extensive excavation to confirm her identity and recover evidence related to her final days. The recovery of all 5 coalition members' remains provided families with the closure they had sought for over a decade, but also revealed the brutal reality of what their loved ones had endured during their final days. Forensic analysis confirmed that the activists had been held captive for several days before their elimination, during which time they had been subjected to interrogation designed to extract information about their research methods, their sources, and their plans for future environmental advocacy. The trial proceedings that began in early 2019 provided the public with comprehensive documentation of the conspiracy that had resulted in the coalition's elimination, revealing the extent to which local environmental protection had been compromised by the relationship between municipal officials and business interests. Testimony from cooperating witnesses painted a disturbing picture of systematic environmental violations that had been protected through intimidation, bribery, and ultimately violence against individuals who threatened to expose the scope of regulatory failures. Former City Councilman Bradley's testimony proved particularly damaging to the defense strategies of several defendants, as his recordings and documentation provided objective evidence of conversations and decisions that defendants attempted to characterize as routine municipal business rather than criminal conspiracy. Bradley's decision to preserve evidence had been motivated by his recognition that the conspiracy extended beyond environmental violations to include systematic corruption that affected multiple aspects of municipal governance. The conviction of 11 defendants on various federal charges related to the conspiracy sent a clear message about the consequences of eliminating environmental advocates, though many observers noted that several individuals who had clearly been involved in the conspiracy had avoided prosecution due to insufficient evidence or successful obstruction of the investigation. The sentences imposed ranged from 15 years for individuals who had played supporting roles in the conspiracy to life imprisonment without parole for those who had directly participated in the elimination of the coalition members. Vincent Carlisle's cooperation with investigators proved crucial, not only for securing convictions in the Millbrook case, but also for identifying similar patterns of environmental advocate intimidation in other communities throughout the region. His testimony revealed that the criminal network involved in the coalition case had been operating in multiple states, providing specialized services for business and political interests, seeking to suppress environmental advocacy through methods ranging from character assassination to physical elimination. The broader investigation that emerged from the coalition case ultimately resulted in federal charges against over 30 individuals across 4 states, revealing a systematic pattern of environmental advocate suppression that had been operating for several years before the Millbrook conspiracy. This expanded investigation provided context for understanding the coalition's elimination as part of a larger pattern of violence against environmental advocates rather than an isolated incident driven by local corruption. The environmental violations that the Green Valley Environmental Coalition had been investigating continued to receive attention even after the resolution of the criminal cases related to their elimination. Federal environmental agencies conducted comprehensive reviews of regulatory enforcement in Millbrook and surrounding areas, identifying systematic failures that had allowed dangerous pollution to continue for years without appropriate oversight or remediation efforts. The coalition's original research, recovered from the burial sites and preserved digital storage devices, provided the foundation for extensive environmental cleanup efforts that continued throughout 2019 and 2020. The comprehensive documentation that Maya Thompson, David Chen, Rebecca Washington, Marcus Rodriguez, and Jennifer Thompson had compiled proved instrumental in identifying pollution sources, documenting health impacts, and developing remediation strategies that addressed the environmental violations they had originally sought to expose. Community response to the revelation of what had happened to the coalition members was complex and emotionally charged, reflecting deep divisions about the appropriate balance between economic development and environmental protection that had contributed to the original conspiracy. While many residents expressed outrage about the elimination of the environmental advocates and supported comprehensive environmental remediation efforts, others worried about the economic impact of increased regulatory oversight and the disruption of established business relationships. The families of the coalition members established the Green Valley Environmental Memorial Foundation, dedicated to supporting environmental advocacy efforts and providing protection for individuals who expose environmental violations in their communities. The foundation's work included lobbying for federal legislation to provide enhanced protection for environmental advocates and supporting legal assistance for communities facing environmental threats similar to those the coalition had been investigating. Detective Rodriguez, who had received national recognition for her investigation of the coalition case, continued working on environmental advocate protection issues throughout her remaining law enforcement career. Her experience with the Millbrook case influenced federal policy discussions about the protection of environmental advocates and contributed to the development of specialized investigative protocols for cases involving potential retaliation against individuals who expose environmental violations. The legacy of the Green Valley Environmental Coalition extended far beyond the specific environmental violations they had been investigating, inspiring a new generation of environmental advocates, while simultaneously highlighting the real dangers faced by individuals who challenge established business and political interests. Their elimination had been intended to silence environmental advocacy in Millbrook, but instead had created a powerful symbol of the courage required to protect community health and environmental integrity against systematic corruption and intimidation. The case officially closed in December 2020, 13 years after the coalition's disappearance, with the completion of all criminal proceedings and the resolution of civil litigation brought by the families against the city and several private defendants. However, the environmental and political reforms that emerged from their sacrifice continued to influence policy discussions and advocacy efforts throughout the region, ensuring that their commitment to environmental protection would continue to generate positive change long after their voices had been silenced.